Hey everyone, so now that we have a better idea about Voronoi fracture, let's look at kind of the evolved version of this that side effects created to make more complex fracturing possible and build in a lot of functionality that back in the day people did by themselves. And of course I'm talking about the RBD material fracture. Again, I want to repeat it again, what's built inside here, what drives all this internally is a Voronoi fracture as well. So it doesn't really do anything different, it just makes it a bit more handy and more complex. So when we just connect it, first of all, it took a little bit to create that, depending on your machine, 1 or 2 seconds or something like that, which can be quite annoying, and we will talk about this because the pre-built settings here are kind of a bit slow. So first of all, what's going on? The first thing that we have here is the material type concrete. We will look at glass and wood later, but for now we start of course with concrete. And the thing is, it is very nice the way it does break it up. It makes for pretty nice fracturing. And the reason is the way it works is, and this is the first thing we want to talk about, the fracture levels. So basically what it does is by default already, it breaks it up into 5 pieces, and then for every piece it breaks each piece again into 5 pieces. And this is what the fracture leveling means here. So let's delete the second one so that we see clearer what's going on. The first thing is it basically does what we all looked at. It actually creates a volume out of this box, scatters 5 points into this volume. This is why it says scatter from volume. And then if we want, we can say, all right, take those 5 pieces and do the same thing again for each. So we end up with 25 with 2 levels. And if we create 3, then of course we end up with 125 pieces overall. Why would you do it that way? Because it actually creates pretty believable fracturing, because that's what would happen in reality. You have big pieces that then break again into smaller pieces. And we'll then talk about later how the constraining of those works, so how this is glued together, but this comes later. So if we just take this into a bullet solver, it will work right away. For now, we will again not use the constraints, we just let it fall down. And for this to work, let's make sure that our box is actually floating. And we could transform the thing before the RBD fracture. And of course, when we move that box upwards, the input of the RBD material fracture has changed. So now we get, as you can see, a different result. So for now, because we will talk about this later, we keep the box at the center and this just move the result up, which looks like this. Okay, and if we now let this fall, you can see, oops, and of course I forgot to create a ground. So that ground plane, and now you can see it's a lot of pieces. Okay, so what's going on here? First of all, as you've seen, we have 3 levels and each of them creates internally a volume. And this is actually what we see down here on the fog volume. And this is one of the reasons why this is relatively slow. So you can see that when let's actually delete the second and third fracture level we just created to keep it simple for now. If you change the scatter points, I think you can see that it's relatively slow. So it's not that you can, move the slider and instantly you see a result. And the reason is, for some reason internally, every single time the volume will be recreated. There are 2 ways of speeding this up. The first way is to just lower the resolution, maybe to 10, because all it needs is some volume. And you can now see it's much faster. The second idea is actually just turn the noise off completely. And then it just scatters it into, well, still a volume, but this volume doesn't have a noise on top anymore, which makes it really fast. And very often in my experience, this is actually fine. If you look here, this is actually a fair distribution. There's nothing wrong with it. If we let this fall down, we can see this is not a bad fracture at all. So there's actually nothing wrong with that. And this can be an option if your setup is too slow, which is especially cool when you have multiple levels and you turn the underlying noise function on the volume off for multiple levels. I created too many. So let's say 3, and each of them have a turned off noise type. Then the whole thing is actually pretty fast. So if I lower the numbers here, it's not, real time, but it's much faster than what you see usually. So this is just something you have to be aware of when working with this. The default settings are not great. in my opinion. That's unnecessarily slow. That said, of course, when you want to use the whole functionality, that's fine. I just wanted to show you what you can do to speed the whole thing up. Let's now talk a bit more about this volume thing. So as we've seen, what's happening here is it just turns this box into a volume, then it runs a noise over this volume, and then it scatters into the noised up volume. Let's delete the second fracture level again. And we can actually, what I want to show you is you can actually visualize that volume. Up here on the guide geometry, besides other things, you can switch this to primary volume, and then you can actually see what comes out of our noised up volume. Again, if you turn this off, you don't see that volume anymore, or it's just an even volume. So this is the noised up version, of course, represented in colors. And what you can see is that the distribution is pretty, uneven. And this is sometimes something you want, but this is the reason why when you move the box up, you will get, let's increase the number of points to see that better. Yeah, even more maybe. So you can see that here in this corner, there is a lot of fracturing, and then around that there's smaller fracturing, and for some reason the primary volume is not updating. So reset cached pass solves that, which is weird that you need to do that, but here's a button for that. And here now you can see why that is, because just because we moved the box with a transform, we moved it in the noise, and this is why the distribution is changing. So my point is you can visualize it. And of course, if you need something more specific, you can change, for example, the noise frequency so that the areas aren't that big. And you can even change the cutoff density, which just means it's a bit basically the contrast of the whole thing. So under that number, the volume will be 0. And there will not be any scattering there. So by changing this number, you basically change the contrast of your density noise. Okay, and when you have multiple levels, let's say, with, of course, different volumes, which you can also force by changing the offset. By the way, by default, it uses the same noise with the same offset. So it's a good idea to change this if you have multiple fracture levels. But currently what I'm seeing is the volume of the first level, and that is because right after the guide geometry there's a visualized depth, and this means you can switch between the two volumes. So this is what's used in the second volume, and again we could change that by changing the offset like we did, or changing the noise frequency, or like I also said, we can just turn it off, which is very often totally fine because you just want a more or less even distribution very often, and that is then achieved very quickly by just not noising the volume up at all. For now, let's move on to the chipping, because this allows you to create on top very small pieces that are specifically created on the edges. And this is what happens in reality all the time. Of course, always the edges are the weakest parts. So whenever you've dropped a phone, you know that it's the edges that suffer the most. And when we look here, you can see that if I turn it off and on, you can see only on the edges there are additional smaller pieces that are created. You can define how many you want. Smaller numbers in the chipping ratio just means you get smaller amounts of chips. And if you increase that, basically every single corner gets something. And then on top, the corner ratio basically says, okay, what is considered a corner? That might sound weird, but obviously this is a corner, but this one here, for example, is not considered a corner unless I increase it, and then it will be understood as a corner too. So this will increase the amount of corners even more. And then you have corner depth, like how big is the distance or the size of those chips. And then directional noise, I'm actually not 100% sure. Yeah, that's just an additional positional noise on top to make it a bit more interesting. So play around with this. And one thing I noticed, and I'm actually a big fan of this, but unfortunately, when you have very complex scenes, also with a lot of fracturing, then this can create problems, unfortunately. Part of it can be the triangulation, which tries to turn off triangles and create quads when it breaks pieces. And in my experience, very often you can get a more stable result by turning the detriangulation off. It creates more stable setups, and it's actually faster. The reason they do that is that you sometimes get a bit of weird geometry. We can't show this here, I think, but just keep that in mind. So feel free to turn this off if you notice some weird behavior. And now I want to show you how this looks like, because it's really cool. You can see you have now really big pieces and those super small, tiny pieces. And I don't know how you feel about it, but this gives a lot of realism to me when I look at this, because this is just something I would expect. Even though we focus on the big pieces, the small pieces are really important to make it believable. And of course, if we combine this with an additional fracture level maybe, then you have the whole range of different piece sizes. And relatively quickly, if you understand those two taps in the beginning, you can create really nice fractures. Of course, we will improve this quality even further later on when we talk about the detail element, where we can break those up. But I don't want to put too much into this video. We just want to start. So the first things we want to look at is the concrete material and the primary fracture and chipping. Those two things you should play around with first to get a feel for it and look what kind of range of interesting fracturing you can get. So that was the theory on a cube, but one thing you will notice when you actually try this on more complex geometry, that very often this here happens. You get those weird planes here in the middle of your geometry. That basically shows you that the geometry is too complex and you might want to simplify it. You can do this, for example, with a remesh to grid, or maybe a normal remesh. There are multiple ways to simplify this geometry, but you can see here it's just built out of very complex detail in this particular case. Another thing is, even if you have better geometry than this, you will potentially run into this problem, and then it really just boils down to try out different settings here until you find a version that doesn't throw this problem. Also, what I noticed is that chipping, as I already mentioned, can create serious problems with more complex geometry, so in this case I left it out. Now, small note here, what we see here is what is used internally, and that is those planes are created procedurally, and then a Boolean setup is used to create those cracks. We will see in a later video how we can do this ourselves, and this is actually the most common workflow for more experienced artists. They do not usually rely on the RBD material fracture for reasons like that it can just unpredictably create errors. And when you build basically the same thing it does yourself, you have more control over the results and can fix things like that easier. I just wanted to mention that. Nonetheless, once you have a solved version of a complex object, it can, for example, look like this. So I just wanted to show you a version besides just a simple cube. And you can see, while it is a bit annoying to work with the RBD material fracture, it can actually result in pretty interesting shapes. So let's go a bit deeper into this node in the next video when we talk about the other material types. But for now, I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later.